Hello there, Evie here, and welcome to my review of the Metallic Gear Neo G Mini. Now, before we get into a quick intro about what this case is, first housekeeping rules: there are Amazon affiliate links in the video description, so you can pick this case up from there, and it will give a small kickback to the channel. And there are also timestamps in the video description, so you can skip to whichever part of the video you like. There is also a pinned comment for you mobile users who want to skip to particular parts of the video. Anyway, intro part of this case. So, first thing, Metallic Gear is a new company that spawned from Phanteks, so it's powered by Phanteks. You see it all over the box. Even on the accessories box, it's powered by Phanteks. There's even a Phanteks riser cable in here, so it's a little bit confusing as to what's going on, but you could see this as a Phanteks case for all intents and purposes. So the Neo G Mini in itself is a mid-sized mini ITX case, so you can't fit micro ATX boards in here, although there are micro ATX cases that are as small as this, something to bear in mind perhaps. It has tempered glass side panels and a sandblasted aluminium top, so some premium features, and coming with that is a more premium cost, mid-range to premium cost of around $70 to $80, around £70, that sort of region. So anyway, thanks for checking this video out. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get everything you can from it. I think I've included pretty much most of the information about this case in this review, and I'll catch you in a second for the unboxing. And there's also thermals and B-roll and, you know, all that sort of stuff coming on later into the video. Anyway, catch you in a second for that unboxing. Starting off with the packaging, let's skip past that part. It's completely fine, don't get me wrong, but that's not what we're here for. So the Metallic Gear Neo G Mini, what's this case got in store for us? Well, first off, there's the obvious tempered glass front and side panels. There's a simple geometric pattern that's printed onto the front panel, which is very clean, but for a glass panel there's a large amount you can't see through, which is completely missing the point of the panel. So moving on to the side panel window, the geometric pattern has been carried over to form a power supply unit shroud, and there's a printed bezel to the edges to form a clean connection. To the corners of the side panels are their respective connections, and continuing down is the filtered intake vent, which just looking at it you can sense trouble ahead, but these lead down to the front I/O. It's a technically average front I/O. We've got the headphone and microphone jacks, an LED lighting control button which also acts as the drive activity LED indicator, and a couple of USB 3.0 ports. In fact, you could probably consider this to be below average, since many other cases also offer a couple of USB 2.0 ports, which can be handy for some slow charging or connecting the odd peripheral. The question is, where's the power and reset buttons? Well, the power button can be found up top, and it looks really clean, which is a word I'm already overusing, but that's what we've got here. Anyway, there's no reset button, which isn't a huge loss, but I perhaps would have liked to have seen the ring around the power button formed as a light, and have that turned into the drive activity LED. When you see the way the drive activity LED is lit later, you might agree with me. The solid side panel is pretty plain except for a large exhaust ventilation section intended for those using a side-mounted radiator. Sounds like a nice idea and it would look great, but there's more to be discussed about that later. There's also another front filtered intake strip to the side of the front panel. The rear of the case is all business, with the top-mounted power supply unit similar to that of the Inwin 301. More comparisons can be drawn between these two later. Further down we have the rear I/O position to the left and a large exhaust ventilation section that wraps around the three vertical PCI Express slot covers. That's right, there's no horizontal graphics card option with this case. Soon we'll be entering an era where horizontal graphics card adapters will be a thing. But there is also the Neo Mini, not the Neo G Mini we have here, that has a steel front instead of glass with a horizontal graphics card mounting option, and the rear fan position if that's what you're into. As for the top, it's a completely solid sandblasted aluminium panel that looks fantastic, but there are no fan placement options or intakes for the power supply unit. Laying the Neo G Mini on its side, we can see what the base has going on. The front has a small slot surrounded by foam padding. It was only after looking in the case further on that I found out this was a strip of LED lights to produce an underglow effect on your desk. Further back is the dust filter, which is interesting since there aren't any fan mounting options to the base, at least not officially. But this could help out air-cooled graphics cards since the front intake area looks so restrictive. Like with most cases, this filter can be removed from the rear, but you don't need to tip your system on its side to remove it. Not that it matters a great deal, but I do appreciate the notches in the feet that provide an initial guide for the filter replacement, and the intermediate supports have curved edges to help with picking up and guiding the filter back into position. I've reviewed enough cases to know that this detail can be forgotten too often, and it's the little things like this that make a case feel that much better. As for the feet themselves, I'm not going to knock this one too much because it has one of the pads misaligned slightly, but the foot is plastic and the pad is hard foam, not rubber. This sounds like a cheaper and lower quality option, but I maintain, as I have in the past, that foam feet are far better than rubber since it allows this case to be slid around on your desk, which is very important for moving a heavy water-cooled build. So that's the exterior dealt with, now for the internals. Stripping the case down to the chassis, starting with the steel panel, a couple of thumb screws to the rear need untightening first. And when I say untightening, these things have been installed with a screwdriver. They're also captive thumb screws, which is always a nice touch, although they can be a little fiddly in my opinion. Also in my opinion, the side panel has the best mounting mechanism with a linear hook towards the front and screws to the rear. None of those awkward multiple hooks and slots to the top and base of the panel. Last note on the side panel, it's created with an adequately thick steel, keeping the panel flex down and the weight and rigidity up. We also have a magnetic applied filter over the vent, which is perfectly suited to the task. Moving on to the side panel window, there are 4 thumb screws that need removing. These have fixed rubber washers and the drilled holes in the glass slot onto rubber posts, which seem to do a good job of holding the panel in position when the screws are removed. I wanted to take a closer look at the pattern on the side panel window. It turns out that it's just long enough to cover a 180mm power supply unit and most of the cables jutting out of it. This also means you don't need to worry too much about the look of your power supply, but if you really wanted to see it, you could rotate the panel 180 degrees, but it's really up to you. Also, if you look close enough and focus between the foreground and the background, things get a little trippy. Anyway, something I want to look at closer was the removal of the top aluminium panel. I think the total screw removal went up to 10 since the offside section of the panel holds some structural value. This also reminds me of the Radiator sticks case, only the screws on this screw into a steel chassis, which is far better for maintaining the threads. I don't think Metallic Gear expects many people to remove this panel, but if you get this case, I strongly encourage you to do so, since it opens up the case so much more, and I'll add tips as we go to help you out in this regard. Something I was wary about when removing the panel was whether the power button was attached to the top panel, and thankfully, Metallic Gear sensibly chose not to do so. Instead, the PCB for the power button is pulling double duty and is also holding the top part of the front chassis to the motherboard tray. Fascinating. As for removing the front panel, I wanted to get inside the case before trying anything out just to make sure I was doing it right. I mean, it is glass after all. It turns out that this is a smarter version of the basic pop-in connection. Now, I'm not saying this to blow smoke up the rear end of Metallic Gear or Phanteks, but this connector doesn't require quite as much force to allow the panel to be removed, which is nice since it's attached to a glass panel. The front panel itself is quite intricately designed. The front is again very clean, and the rear allows for 6 connections back to the chassis, and a filtered ventilation through the front. Speaking of which, the plastic molded filter components don't seem to have gotten through the manufacturing process scot-free. It almost looks like the mesh filter didn't sit very well into the mold, so a pattern was left on the external surface of the component. It's not noticeable from afar, but up close and in person, it's easier to catch. I'm not railroading on this one since it's not a big deal, but all I'm saying is it exists here. Moving on to the chassis and internals of the case, we'll cover the accessories in a bit. To the front, there's room for a couple of 140 or 120mm fans and a 240 or 280mm radiator. And right at the bottom are the PCBs for the front I/O and the light controller, which we'll be covering in more detail later, with all the cables neatly routed around the bottom towards the rear of the motherboard tray. There's also an included 120mm unnamed RGB fan, so your build can glow uniformly, as long as you're only looking at the bottom half. Back to the cables for a second. I don't think there's much more annoying in a review video than not disclosing what's on offer. So the bunch cable to the left is a proprietary 4-pin LED output connector with a pass-through to another input connector from the front fan. Next is a proprietary 4-pin LED output connector from the front LED with a pass-through to a second. Then we have a universal LED input connector to link the LED controller to your motherboard, and then a SATA power connector to feed all the LED madness. Next is the 3-pin connector to power the fan, and last but not least, the power and drive activity indicator connectors. As for the rear of the motherboard tray, well, there's a lot going on here. First, there's a USB 3.0 and audio cables that split from the pack, but more importantly, to the left we have support for a 3.5-inch drive or a couple of 120mm fans, which can be coupled with a 240mm radiator, and to the right we have a rather sizable power supply unit cable overflow section to the top with straps to suit, and the section below is completely filled up with a 2.5-inch drive bracket, which covers the rear of the motherboard access, and is suitable for 2 7mm thick drives. It's held in place with a single thumb screw and can be removed now for use later. Now onto the main compartment. Starting with the front of the motherboard tray, we have this unusual cover panel. Unusual in the sense that it's not usually a feature of most cases. Nice to have if you don't plan on using the space behind for a drive or radiator. The rear of the case doesn't have much more than what we've already covered, but the motherboard tray has all 4 standoffs for the supported ITX motherboard standard pre-installed, and 2 of them are standoff posts, which is great. But the base of the case supports one of the main features of this case, the vertical graphics card support. This comprises of a 16x PCI Express slot with an extender mounted to a PCB which has its own mount to secure it to the base of the case. And like metallic gear, your graphics card too can be powered by, or with, Phanteks. And just before we move on to the accessories and installing a system, a little personal preference of mine has been added, or removed in this case. This case doesn't come with one of those plastic PCI Express slot cover screw covers. I prefer to maintain with a solid steel construction and do away with small bits of plastic that can dilute the quality of the case, in my opinion. Great job, Metallic Gear. Or Phanteks. Okay, last stop before we install the system, the accessories box. Inside the box is a bag of screws and wire ties, as well as the user manual. In terms of screws, we have 13 screws for the motherboard and 2.5-inch drives, 14 power supply unit screws, 8 fan screws, 3 hard disk drive screws, and 6 zip ties. As for the manual, it's pretty basic, but the case is really intuitive and open in comparison to many others, so it kind of gets away with it completely fine. Not to get too down on the manual, the little that's there is helpful, especially the clearances section. Although you'll want to stick around for the CPU cooler clearance section. So with the graphics card closest to the CPU, you've got around 80mm of clearance. With a dual slot graphics card positioned furthest away from the CPU, you've got about 100mm of clearance, and with a single slot graphics card, you should be good for about 120mm CPU cooler. And of course, without a graphics card, say a 2400G build, you'll have about 160mm of clearance. Anyway, sorry for spending so long on that, let's get on with the build. I wanted to speed install the CPU water block just to show the sheer amount of thermal paste used in case someone wants to draw any conclusions later on based on the paste. So installing the motherboard is a piece of cake in this case. There's plenty of room around the motherboard position, and as mentioned earlier, there are 2 standoff posts that hold the motherboard against the rear I/O while you sort out the screws. Now usually I'd be installing the power supply unit next, but since it's up top, I'm sorting the front of the case out first. Now if you thought up to this point there's been a lot to look at, then this is where the case moves up another level of complexity. The front of the case can support up to a 280mm radiator, which is great, but there are a few constraints. The top of the radiator is right against the chassis and the power switch, which could be short in the connection, but that doesn't matter since the base of the radiator can't fit against the chassis due to the height constraint of the power's PCB up top. But even if you could fit it in place, you'd be unable to install a radiator on the side panel, but let's focus on that side panel for radiator options. I threw a 240mm radiator to the front of the case here, but let's ignore that for now. To the base of the case there's a pop-out section for cable management. This prevents a radiator from being installed against the chassis, so you'll have to have fans against the chassis and have the radiator on show, which if anything is the optimal way to go. But if you have a 240mm radiator by the motherboard, you'll be able to install fans in the front, but not a radiator. There's barely a few millimeters of room for the fans. But here's the kicker. You'll have about a third of your intake fans covered up, and I know they're positioned as exhausts, but you get the point. However, if you flipped all of this on its head and you went for a side intake and a front intake, you would have plenty of airflow for the RAM, VRM, and graphics card if it's air-cooled. Deciding between the two options is a tricky one, and if I were to suggest a maximum radiator option for each, I'd say if you have a 275mm long graphics card, the front can take a 45mm thick radiator with one set of 25mm thick fans, and with a dual slot graphics card mounted furthest away from the motherboard, you could mount up to a 75mm thick radiator with a set of 25mm thick fans. But at that size you may want to change it to a 50mm thick radiator and 2 sets of fans, but that's your choice. So as you can see, I've opted for the 280mm 45mm thick radiator option with a couple of 140mm wide 25mm thick fans. But I screwed up since I didn't replace the side panel cover, and I decided I wanted the inlets of the radiator up top where they'll be more accessible once the graphics card is in place. This is where a juggling act comes into play. So the next step was to shift the PCI Express slot over to the furthest position from the motherboard. The swap is super simple. There are a couple of screws fixing it to the base that need unscrewing, and then the unit can be shifted up to the next set of guides where the screws can hold the unit in place again. So before the PCI Express extender covers the lower section of the motherboard, the front I/O needed sorting out and connecting to the motherboard. Next, since I didn't have a mount for the pump to a 280mm radiator, I had to work some sort of mount for the pump that wouldn't look terrible. I found fixing it to the overflow exhaust to the rear was pretty much one of the only options that it would physically fit, but of course I had to ditch a reservoir. Now the PCI Express extender can be linked to the motherboard, but in my case I should have left this until I installed the drive also to the rear overflow section. In hindsight, I should have placed my boot drive somewhere else, since if I had a connection issue I'd have a hell of a time trying to access it here. And just to fill you in on why I'm doing this, I've got 3 2.5-inch drives, so I need to put one drive in an unofficial mounting position. At this point I wanted to double check whether the top panel would fit with the radiator in position, and unfortunately it wouldn't. It would appear that the primary clash was with a screw head holding the power button cover in position, but I have a feeling that there would have been a further clash if this wasn't the case. This is one of the reasons why you can't rely on a manufacturer to physically spec out your systems. This case apparently has clearance for a 330mm radiator, but this 322mm radiator doesn't fit. But it does officially fit if you have the outlets at the bottom. But I want the outlets at the top for ease of access, so I'm going down the unofficial mounting procedure of holding the fan and the radiator unit to the chassis with 4 screws instead of 8, which is fine since the radiator is sitting on the floor of the case. However, there's still trouble ahead. Because the fans don't perfectly line up with the cutouts now, there's no extra clearance for the fan blades to move at high speeds. There's a high chance of a clash between the fan blades and the chassis now. So while I'm here and haven't fully built the system, I'm adding a couple of washers in to increase the travel distance. We're not adding a lot of travel, but it only needs to be a millimeter or so to prevent any damage from occurring. Now for the graphics card. This needs to be slotted right underneath the pump, and it's a tight squeeze. Just to go over some system specs here, the CPU under the water block is an i7-6700K, which is stock clocked at 4GHz and set to 1.2 volts. And the graphics card is an R9 390X clocked at 1150MHz on the core and 1550MHz on the memory, and is dressed up in an EKWB R9 390X water block. As for building the runs between all the components, this was a hell of a back and forth process, but here's what I came up with. I preset a short run between the CPU and pump, and then lowered the pump in with its own preset run through to the graphics card. But the run was only half baked, so it needed meeting halfway with a couple of angle adapters from the graphics card block. I know it looks like a mess, but that's how many mini ITX water cooling builds go, and this isn't even a small ITX case. It all comes down to the spread of components, but you could go for a pump mounting bracket for the front radiator, and then you'd have a much neater looking build. I'm happy how the pump adapter and graphics card positions turned out though. It almost didn't work, and they are touching tips, and I'm okay with that. Moving on to the other drives, I've got a couple of 2.5-inch drives to go into the back which need to be attached to this 2.5-inch drive bracket. There's no real complaints from me with this bracket, it's simple and well designed, and slotting it back into the case was easy. Just make sure you set the drive positions around the right way. Now for the power supply unit. You could go for a 180mm power supply unit in this case, there is support for it, but I wanted a little more room for the cables and the tubing runs, so we're going for a 160mm one here. But this is where I screwed up, and didn't leave enough room between the power supply unit and the tubing runs. If you look close enough, you may even be able to notice the tubes are full of water. I thought the power supply unit installation was going to be the finishing move, but I had to go back to the drawing board with this one, and just because I make mistakes, it doesn't mean you have to sit through the repair. So I drained, rebuilt the runs between the CPU block and radiator and through to the graphics card block, and then changed over to some red water to round off the build. So something I wanted to go over is setting up the LED lighting strips, and more specifically when the LED inputs or the input connectors for your LED lighting strip don't match the output connector for the controller or whatever you're using, the motherboard controller, however it goes. So if you want to skip this sort of thing, then please go to the timestamps in the video description, or the time here if I remember to put it. Skip forward to that, it'll probably be about 5 minutes or so. But yeah, I want to go into some detail to inform you as to how you'd go about that. It's very simple and you can probably work it out yourself like I have here, but if you don't know and this is kind of, you don't want to fiddle around things too much and you're unsure, then we'll go over that now. So, what I've got here is an LED lighting strip with the connectors, the input connectors for this LED lighting strip is voltage, blue, red, green. So there's a plus sign for voltage, and then it goes BRG. Now the output connector for the Phanteks, it's a proprietary connector, and it does say connect this connector with Phanteks' multicolor LED strips only. So if you want to maintain or sort of stay within the warranties of this case, then please follow that guidance. I have done videos of this kind of explanation before, and I haven't mentioned that, and I've had companies contact me saying, please mention, you know, when you do something like that, because it, you know, it will void a warranty. That will void your warranty most likely. But anyway, moving on. Just, you know, if you want to carry on down this train, then what you need to do is check what the differences are between the input on your LED lighting strip and the output on the connector or the power source. So what it has is a voltage, and it has a BGR. So voltage BGR, and here it has voltage BRG. So the red and the green are swapped around. But that's not a problem. We'll go over that now. So first things first, you want to make sure you're working with the correct voltages. Now, what you can do is use some common sense and say, right, there is a SATA connector, and the SATA connector provides 12 volt power, and there is no complex transformer on this PCB. It's just a straight SATA connector and two pin or two wires going through to the input. So you can use common sense and say there's no transformer, it's going to be 12 volts. But you can double check this if you want to make sure. You can double check this and use some sort of ground source, such as the shroud to the DVI connector there, that's grounded. And then we can go over to the voltage pin, and it will say it's 12.25 volts. So 12.25 volts, that's for all intents and purposes 12 volts. So this will work correctly with our LED lighting strip. So from this point onwards then, just to go over that point actually, you can connect, you can definitely connect a plus 5 volt source to a 12 volt LED strip. That's fine. You can connect a 12 volt strip to a 5 volt strip to a 12 volt source. Yes, it will be providing more power, and the chances of it wearing out or blowing something or destroying something in the meantime is higher, but it does work. I've connected, say, 6 5 volt strips to a 12 volt transformer, and it's been fine. But bear in mind, it may not work. So from this point onwards then, what you want to do is get yourself some wires. Now I've used these wires, and I've got them from basically an Arduino project kit. You can go to basically any DIY electronics store, not necessarily a DIY hardware store, but more specific to electronics, or go onto Amazon and you can pick up just a small kit of these little wiring things. They have pins either side, and then you connect the voltage to the voltage pin, the voltage of the outputs to the voltage of the input, the blue to the blue, the green to the green, the red to the red. What will happen is you'll need to swap around the wires. Now, what happens if you don't swap around the wires and you just put the direct output, so 1, 2, 3, and 4 wire pins go to 1, 2, 3, 4 on the connectors? What you'll do is connect the voltages together, which is great. Double check that, make sure the voltage is connected to the voltage. Just double check that. And then you connect randomly the red, the green, the blue connected together, and you'll have a mismatch between the color of the case lighting and the color of the LED strip. But if you connect it all together, completely fine, so you connect the red to the red, the green to the green, the blue to the blue, when you turn it on, you get a correspondence between the lighting coming out of the case and the lighting coming out of the LED strip, and you can switch between all the lighting modes you want. So we'll go through, so you've got your purple there, we're going for red there, red, and all that sort of stuff. You will have a match between all of them, which is perfect and exactly what you want. Now, you can connect this controller at the front to your motherboard for RGB control, and you can do this method to make sure your case lighting is matching your LED lighting strips and that sort of stuff if you haven't got the right connectors. I haven't got motherboard control because I'm using a Z170 series board, and it was only a Z270, I think, series board, so that generally had that functionality to connect, control directly from the motherboard. But of course, you do have a smorgasbord of LED lighting controllers on the market that you can use. But again, if they don't match up, or you have a mismatch in colors from your LED lighting strips to anything inside, then you can double check the connectors themselves. I know the output connectors on the strip here actually shows that it is also BRG and then the 12 volt. So just triple check all that stuff. double check that 12 volt, and I think that's it. I could go on forever just rambling about random crap, but I'll hold it off there. Hopefully that is useful to you in some point. And a last point, I would definitely, once you've finished muddling around with all this stuff, I'd probably put some insulation tape around the exposed bits of the wires that are there, and then just tape it all at the end just to make sure it all stays connected correctly, and you don't have any sort of dodgy half connections or anything like that that could cause any problems down the line. So, hope you enjoyed that. I hope you're enjoying the video so far and it's been useful for you, and let's move on to whatever the hell I want to talk about next. So in a classic state of poor organisation, we're going to check out the finished build and then move on to the thermal testing results. So in terms of thermals, this should be quite simple to run through since there's only the thermal take level 20 VT that's been water-cooled since the test methodology refresh. Some quick housekeeping rules. The key is at the bottom, general specs are at the top, and the thermal results are presented in a delta T format, meaning the ambient temperature of the room has been subtracted from the temperature of the components. It's an efficient way of normalizing the results, and you can add about 20 degrees Celsius to get an idea of the true component temperature. Also, all fans are running at full speed to negate fan curve variables. So without further ado, let's burn through these results. Starting off with 3D Mark Firestrike, comparing the level 20 VT to the Neo G Mini is pretty even, but for one reason or another, the graphics card of the level 20 VT got way hotter and the CPU was way cooler than that of the Neo G Mini. But the kicker here is the level 20 VT was running a 200mm radiator and two 240mm radiators. Graphics Test 2 on the other hand mixed things up, showing some clear improvements on the side of the level 20, and rightly so. It's a massive micro ATX case in comparison to a mid-size mini ITX case. We'll shift off Firestrike in a second, but the physics test shows the graphics card on the level 20 VT was able to cool itself down during the low load test, and it's clear that the three radiators in the level 20 VT are outperforming the single 280mm radiator of the Neo G Mini. So in an effort to find information of value, we're going to skip past the Unigine benchmarks, pause if you want to read them, and we'll get into some gaming benchmarks. Rise of the Tomb Raider showed the Neo G Mini topped out the CPU at about 27 degrees delta T, and the graphics card hit around 37 degrees delta T. Comparing these to the level 20 VT results, it's all backwards and it's virtually incomparable. You know what, we're not getting anywhere with this. Let's just crank the CPU and GPU to 11 and see what Prime 95 and Thermark had to offer. So the reality of the situation is, even with a single 280mm 45mm thick radiator, you can still keep a 6700K under a true 100 degrees Celsius. But here's the thing, if you're playing games, a single 280mm radiator is more than enough. Even if you're creating videos and need to render for 2 hours at a time, you'll still be sitting around 80 to 90 degrees Celsius mark, which is completely fine every now and then. But if you want to keep everything below 70 degrees Celsius in every possible scenario, then you'll either need a shorter graphics card to fit in a larger radiator, or go for a 140mm 40mm thick lower radiator and a 140mm 80mm thick upper radiator to maximize the cooling potential. I strongly think there's a large bottleneck to the front of this case, and the lack of a rear fan doesn't help. Perhaps the Neo Mini with a horizontal graphics card orientation will perform better in this regard. So there we have it, we're wrapping up for the end of the review. So I just wanted to go over a few things I've made lists or little notes of, just to round things off a little bit. So it's a little pros, cons, missed opportunities list. I've done this a few times in the past. I kind of like it to summarize what's happened, especially in a 40-minute video. A lot of people will skip towards the end maybe, and maybe this is a good opportunity to catch up on a few things. So we'll start off with pros. We'll make it like a, I don't know, a positivity sandwich, or what the hell they call it. So pros, actually normally that should come at the end. Anyway, finish is fantastic. There really isn't any problems. I think the brushed aluminium, the sandblasted aluminium up top is really strong. It's a sort of a more rugged version than I've seen in the past. So it seems to be pretty good with actually taking little knocks here and there. I haven't seen any of the finish scraped off, so that's fantastic. The build quality of the whole case is just, you know, top notch really. I don't really see anything. I haven't seen anything that is concerning. I like that they didn't attach that little screw cover towards the back of the PCI Express slot covers. They just look really cheap, and when you have them on cheaper cases, it's a little flimsy bit of plastic which probably end up breaking if you end up stepping on it or something. So it's actually nice they didn't include that. It makes it look a lot more classy. Radiator options. I'm adding this as a pro, but it's also a kind of con in whatever way you see it. Really, you can only fit in one large radiator into this. You can't fit in two, but you could mod perhaps to fit in two, but realistically, only one large radiator in here. It's one of those things, when you look at lots of options in a case, sometimes you go, oh, I'll fit a radiator on the side and at the front, and it'll be amazing, there'll be this cool airflow going through there, and a little leftover around here. It doesn't really work that way with this case. It's one in some position you fancy. Now, it looks better having it on the side, but on the front is really optimal, because you can really pack in a much larger 280mm radiator and have that front area, which makes a lot of difference. Anyway, I like the power supply unit shroud. I think that's a great idea. The InWin 301 is kind of a very comparable case to this one. It's a bit smaller, but it's very comparable in the sense that, I mean, it has a top-mounted power supply unit and all those sorts of things, but it also has sort of things like a rear fan position, that sort of stuff. Maybe it's actually a little bit bigger. I haven't actually looked at the actual measurements for those things. But anyway, this is a really nice way of adding a detail to hide the power supply unit, but also not constrained by adding more metal in and all that sort of stuff. So if you went for, say, a small form factor power supply unit on here, you've got more airflow room around, say, your CPU cooler and that sort of stuff, which is, you know, fantastic. And then finally on the sort of pros list is buildability. I really think taking that top panel off really opens up options for you to be able to actually work within this case, rather than a lot of other ones like the InWin 301 was a difficult one because the top panel just would not come off, but they've made a really clean connection to the back, and the tempered glass around the front has a pretty clean connection to the top. So moving on to cons, we'll go to missed opportunities at the end. Cons, the front I/O, it's not really a con in a sense, not a con. I say negatives, I should say positives and negatives, because con sounds a little bit like really aggressive negative. But anyway, a negative, I'd say, is the front I/O. There, I would like to see maybe a couple more USB ports there, because it is handy sometimes, because I end up putting in, say, my SD card adapter into there, and it'll end up taking up one slot or two in some cases, and it would be nice to have another maybe one or two slots there. But that's a personal preference, maybe not everyone's. So, cable management. I'm not sure if I didn't note actually pick it up, but cable management room or behind the motherboard tray is really tight. It is really tight. It is actually the side panel is actually bulging out by a few millimeters on the other side. You may have seen that in some footage. It's not very noticeable, but it is bulging because I had to really force that panel on. So I really would like another 5 millimeters of room back there. Would be fantastic. So I think one issue I've got is thermals. Now I haven't air tested this thing yet, and that's something I want to shift onto, but I may not actually cover in a video because I've got a lot of other things to do on this channel. But I think that the filtered front intakes are a little bit too small in terms of their free area, and especially when you think of a 280mm radiator in the surface area of there, you've about that much space. You're getting two small slits that are filtered to supply air through to that, so a little bit tight maybe. Thermal, so yeah, not fantastic. CPU cooler clearance. Now, I have this down as a negative because it's not very well explained. It is, you know, it's very simply explained. It gives a rough idea of what you can put in there, but it's difficult, and there aren't a lot of coolers that are below 100 millimeters that are that attractive in terms of tower-style coolers. You can go with top-down coolers, but there aren't many tower-style coolers, perhaps, that would work well with this case, since you've got very much front-to-back airflow, and you don't have anything. There's no fan in the back here, so you can't encourage any air from a top-down style cooler that's blowing out heat from the sides to be sucked out the back. It just needs to be propagated through from the intake at the front, wherever you have it. So, yeah, CPU cooler clearance can be a problem for most people, I can imagine. So missed opportunities then. I would have liked to seen a rear 80mm fan position to help with problems like that. So you can put in a little 80mm fan, just put it at a low speed so it's not too noisy, and it will just help with the airflow through. I think that would be a great addition maybe for a second revision of this case. I would have liked to seen, coupled with more more space for cable management to the rear, more sort of depth there, an extra 5mm onto the case. I'd like to have seen perhaps around the radiator support area, the 3.5-inch drive support area, and maybe I would have liked to seen some more 2.5-inch drive support. For a mini ITX case, I think 2.5-inch drives are very apt, so maybe more of that in the future would be fantastic. Drive indicator LED, I'm not sure if you picked up on it in the B-roll. If not, then head back, and it's about a third way through the B-roll, maybe 30 seconds in. It's just it's a single red LED that's coming through a sort of translucent plastic cover. It really doesn't look that nice. I perhaps would have liked to, maybe my suggestion in the video, would have liked to have an LED sort of illuminating ring around the power button up top to do the drive indicator LED work. But again, maybe that would have been a missed opportunity or a con in regards if that did happen, because I'm not sure if you sleep in the same room to which you have your computer, but having top LEDs means that you can get flashing onto the ceiling, and that's annoying when you're trying to sleep. Again, these are small problems that are personal to each person. But anyway, only one front LED fan is included with this case. That, to me, is just a bit weird, because it's a nameless LED fan, and I'm not sure if you can pick it up elsewhere, but I can imagine if you tried to, then you went onto their site. In fact, I've been on their site, and all they've got in products is cases at the moment. Getting another one of those fans would be nice, but it's a nameless one, so getting one would probably be very difficult. But having one is weird. It's strange having one lit LED part of the front, not two, and having it even throughout. It's just strange. They should either put in two or just don't bother with an LED fan, because it's just strange to me. But again, personal preference, so after that, and airflow guidance. I think this case is a little bit tricky because there are so many options to initially find out this is the best way to set up your system. I'd have liked to, and I have seen in the past some companies put out in sort of their advertising material, their marketing material, sort of setups that they put in there. And Cooler Master is actually one that's really bad for this, because they put in really bad setups in their marketing material. But it would be nice to have a little bit more. This is an optimal setup that we recommend, and we've done some testing, and we found this to be sort of one of the better testing setups to go with. So whether you have a front or a side radiator and that sort of stuff, be nice to have. But anyway, I'd like to see that actually from more companies, so not just Metallic Gear or Phanteks, more companies putting out more relevant material. I know it means that closes the scope for reviewers to do stuff, but again, it still needs to be critiqued if they do that, so it would need to be double checked. But anyway, that's pretty much my review. Again, if you want to purchase this case, you can head to the Amazon affiliate links in the video description. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I may be covering a bit of air-cooled stuff on this case, but apart from that then, I have got a review coming up at some point in the future on the Thermaltake V200 Tempered Glass Edition, and yeah, I think that's about it. I'm probably a bit too far over to be able to actually fit my sort of ending screen now. I didn't plan this very well. Anyway, thanks guys, I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.